Rain poured hard that night, cold and unforgiving. A woman stood outside a tall iron gate, her thin dress soaked through her hands, trembling around a small, battered suitcase. Behind the gate, warm lights glowed from a luxurious mansion, a life she had built with her own sacrifices. From inside, a man's shadow turned away. No hesitation, no mercy. The gate slammed shut. Her knees almost gave out as she whispered his name, but the rain swallowed her voice. She didn't know that at that exact moment her life was about to change in a way no one could imagine, not even the man who had just thrown her away. Before we begin this story, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your country. And if you believe real-life stories still carry powerful lessons, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Long before the rain-soaked night, when Amina stood outside the iron gate with a broken suitcase and a heavier heart, there had been a different kind of life. A quieter one, a poorer one. But also, in its own fragile way, a sincere one. Amina had met Kofi when they were both young and hopeful in Accra, a city that never slept but often forgot the poor. She sold fruits by the roadside back then, balancing a tray of oranges and bananas on her head from dawn until the heat burned her shoulders raw. Kofi was a junior clerk in a small logistics company, earning barely enough to pay for a single room in a crowded compound house. They met by accident on a dusty afternoon when Kofi stopped to buy oranges with the last coins in his pocket. "Please give me the ripe ones," he had said shyly. Amina smiled, noticing how carefully he counted his money. "They're all ripe." "Take 2 extra. You look like someone who skipped lunch." Kofi protested at first, embarrassed, but Amina insisted, pushing the fruit into his hands as if kindness were the most natural thing in the world. That moment stayed with him longer than he ever admitted. They married quietly 2 years later. No grand ceremony, no luxury hall. Just family, a borrowed canopy, and music played from an old speaker that crackled more than it sang. Amina wore a simple dress she had sewn herself. Kofi borrowed a suit that didn't quite fit, but when they looked at each other, it felt like enough. Life after marriage was hard, harder than either of them had expected. They rented a single-room apartment with cracked walls and a leaking roof. During the rainy season, Amina would place buckets on the floor to catch water dripping from the ceiling. At night, she lay awake listening to the rain and to Kofi's breathing, wondering how they would survive another month. She never told him her fears. Instead, she worked harder. Amina woke up before sunrise every day. She cooked, cleaned, and then went out to sell food and do small tailoring jobs for neighbors. Sometimes she walked long distances to save transport fare, her feet aching by the time she returned home. Kofi, meanwhile, grew restless. "I won't always be like this," he said one night as they sat on the edge of their bed, counting bills that never seemed enough. "One day, I'll be someone important. You'll see." Amina smiled and touched his arm. "I already see you as important." But Kofi didn't hear that part. What he heard was the echo of laughter from people who passed him in better cars. The judgment in their eyes when he mentioned where he lived, the way his boss barely remembered his name. Poverty didn't just empty his pockets, it gnawed at his pride. When Kofi was offered a promotion opportunity that required further training, the company demanded fees he couldn't afford. He came home that evening, crushed his shoulders, slumped. "I've failed again," he muttered. Amina didn't hesitate. That same night, she sold her small sewing machine, the one thing that brought her extra income and a sense of independence. She handed the money to Kofi the next morning. "What is this?" he asked, shocked. "For your training," she said simply. Kofi stared at her. "But this is how you earn." "I'll find another way," Amina interrupted gently. "Your future matters more." That was the first time something shifted inside him. Gratitude, yes, but also something darker. A sense of debt he didn't know how to repay, and a quiet fear that he was standing on a foundation built entirely by her sacrifices. Over the next few years, Kofi's career began to improve. Slowly at first, then faster. He changed companies, moved into management, started attending meetings where people wore watches that cost more than his annual salary. Amina remained the same. She wore simple clothes. She spoke softly. She avoided gatherings where she felt out of place. When Kofi bought new shirts and shoes, she clapped proudly, never asking for anything for herself. But others noticed. At work events, Kofi watched colleagues arrive with glamorous wives, women who spoke confidently, laughed loudly, and fit effortlessly into expensive spaces. Amina, when she came, stood quietly by his side, her hands folded, her smile polite but unsure. One evening, after a company dinner, Kofi sighed loudly as they rode home in a taxi. "You didn't say much tonight," he said. Amina looked at him surprised. "I didn't want to interrupt. Everyone seemed busy." "You make it awkward," Kofi snapped, then immediately regretted his tone. Amina lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry." That apology echoed in his mind long after she had gone to sleep. From that day on, a subtle distance grew between them. Kofi began staying out later, attending networking events without her, buying cologne and expensive shoes, polishing a version of himself that felt increasingly disconnected from the man who once counted coins for oranges. Amina noticed, of course. She noticed everything. But she chose silence. At night, she prayed for her husband's success, for their marriage, for patience. What she didn't know was that the very sacrifices that once bound them together were slowly becoming the reason Kofi felt ashamed. In his mind, Amina began to represent the life he was trying to escape, the poverty, the struggle, the past he wanted erased. And yet, every meal he ate, every shirt he wore, every step forward he took was rooted in her unseen labor. The irony was cruel. On a quiet Sunday morning, as Amina washed clothes outside, she watched Kofi leave the house in polished shoes and a pressed shirt. He barely glanced back. "Good luck today," she called softly. He nodded without turning. Amina stood there, hands wet with soap, watching his figure disappear down the road. A strange heaviness settled in her chest, a feeling she couldn't name yet. She didn't know it then, but this was the beginning of the end of the marriage she had poured her entire soul into. Success did not arrive in Kofi's life like a celebration. It came quietly, wearing a suit, speaking in polished phrases, and demanding that he leave parts of himself behind. Within a year, Kofi's position at the firm changed dramatically. He now supervised teams, signed documents that once terrified him, and sat in meetings where decisions affected hundreds of workers. His name began to circulate. People shook his hand a little longer. They listened when he spoke, and with every step upward, the gap between him and Amina grew wider. At first, it was subtle. He stopped asking her opinion about work. Then he stopped telling her about his day altogether. Dinner conversations became short and practical. "How was work?" Amina would ask, setting food on the table. "Fine," Kofi replied, scrolling through his phone. She learned to accept that single word. Amina still woke early, still cooked, still stretched small amounts of money into full meals. But now, the house felt quieter, heavier. It was as if joy had learned to tiptoe around Kofi's moods. One evening, Amina waited up late, sitting on the edge of the bed with a shawl around her shoulders. Kofi had promised to come home early. Midnight came and went. When he finally arrived, his clothes smelled of expensive perfume and city air. "You didn't call?" Amina said softly. Kofi sighed, loosening his tie. The meeting ran late. Every meeting she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He turned to her sharply. "Do you want me to lose my job? Do you know how competitive things are at my level?" Amina flinched. "I was just worried." "Well, don't be," he said, already walking away. "I'm not a child." That night, Amina cried silently into her pillow, careful not to let him hear. At work, Kofi's world was changing fast. He was introduced to board members, invited to exclusive dinners, and seated next to people who spoke confidently about investments, real estate, and global markets. Their conversations flowed easily, except when the topic turned personal. So, Kofi, a colleague, asked one evening, swirling wine in his glass, "What does your wife do?" Kofi hesitated. She manages things at home." There was a brief silence, polite smiles. Then the conversation moved on. That silence stayed with him. When others talked about their wives' careers, fashion sense, and social connections, Kofi felt something twist inside his chest. He began to see Amina through the eyes of those rooms, not as the woman who sold her sewing machine for his future, but as someone who didn't belong where he was going. One night, after a corporate event, Kofi drove home alone. The city lights blurred past him. Instead of relief, he felt irritation. Why did everything feel so heavy at home? Amina greeted him with a warm smile. "I saved you dinner," she said. Kofi glanced at the food. Simple, familiar, ordinary. "I already ate," he replied, though he hadn't. Amina nodded and began packing the food away. "You don't need to wait up for me anymore," he added, his tone flat. She paused. "I like waiting." "Well, don't," he snapped. "It makes me feel guilty." The word hung between them like smoke. "Guilty?" Amina turned slowly. "I never wanted you to feel that way." "I know," Kofi said, rubbing his forehead. "That's the problem." He didn't explain. He didn't need to. Something had shifted and both of them felt it. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Kofi started correcting Amina in public. "No, don't say it like that," he muttered once at a gathering. "Why are you wearing this?" he asked. Another time, embarrassment sharp in his voice. Amina tried. She really did. She changed how she spoke, borrowed dresses from friends, watched how other women behaved. But every effort only made her feel smaller, less herself. One afternoon, she confronted him. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked, standing in the small living room they once laughed in. Kofi didn't answer immediately. He looked tired, older. "I just need space," he said finally. "You wouldn't understand." Amina's throat tightened. Try me. He shook his head. You're still living in survival mode. I'm not there anymore. The words cut deeper than any shout. So, I'm holding you back, she asked. Kofi looked away. Silence was his answer. That night, Amina knelt beside her bed and prayed harder than she ever had. Not for money, not for comfort, just for clarity. Meanwhile, temptation circled Kofi quietly. At work, there was a woman, confident, well-dressed, always perfectly composed. Lydia. She laughed at his jokes, asked about his goals, never mentioned his past. You're impressive, she told him one afternoon. You don't act like someone who came from nothing. Kofi smiled, something warm blooming in his chest. That's because I didn't stay there, he replied. With Lydia, he felt admired, not indebted. Desired, not reminded. There were no sacrifices to acknowledge. No guilt to manage. Just him, the version he wanted to be. When he came home that evening, Amina was mending a torn shirt. You should throw that away, Kofi said. It's still usable, she replied. Why do you always think small? He snapped, frustration spilling out. Amina looked up stunned. Thinking small kept us alive. Kofi froze. For a moment, he saw everything: the long walks, the sold sewing machine, the quiet strength. Shame rushed in like a wave. Then his phone buzzed. Lydia's name lit the screen. And just like that, the moment passed. Kofi turned away, answering the call with a softened voice Amina hadn't heard in months. Amina watched him, understanding settling in her chest like cold truth. Her husband was no longer fighting poverty. He was fighting the memory of who helped him survive it. Lydia entered Kofi's life the way temptation often does, without force, without noise, and without asking permission. She worked in a partner firm that collaborated closely with Kofi's company. From the first meeting, she stood out, not because she was louder than everyone else, but because she seemed effortlessly at ease in places where Kofi still felt like an invited outsider. Lydia wore confidence the way others wore perfume, lightly but unmistakably. She spoke clearly in meetings. She laughed easily. She knew which fork to use at dinners without looking around to check what others were doing first. And most dangerously, she looked at Kofi as if he were already the man he desperately wanted to become. You don't act like someone who doubts himself, she said once after a presentation, walking beside him toward the parking lot. That's rare. Kofi felt a strange warmth spread through his chest. Praise from Lydia felt different, cleaner, lighter. At home, Amina had been quiet that evening, her mind occupied with unpaid bills and a neighbor who needed help with sewing. She barely noticed when Kofi arrived late again. How was your day? She asked, setting food on the table. Busy, he replied, distracted. She nodded, used to that answer now. The next time Lydia and Kofi spoke, it was over coffee, then lunch, then long conversations after work that stretched just a little too far into the evening. With Lydia, Kofi talked about ambition, about power, about the future he wanted. She never asked about his wife, and Kofi never mentioned her. That omission started small. A missing detail here, a vague answer there. But soon Amina's name began to fade from Kofi's version of himself. In Lydia's presence, he was not a married man with obligations and history. He was a rising executive, sharp and deserving of more. One evening, Lydia glanced at her phone and sighed dramatically. Another charity gala, she said. Sometimes I wonder if people even care about substance anymore. Kofi smiled. It's all about appearances. She raised an eyebrow. You understand that too well. Those words settled somewhere deep inside him. At home, appearances had become something else entirely. Amina still wore the same modest dresses, still avoided unnecessary spending, still spoke carefully gently, as if afraid to disturb the fragile air between them. One night, as they prepared for bed, Kofi watched her remove her earrings, simple studs she had worn for years. Why don't you ever change your look? He asked suddenly. Amina paused. Do you want me to? I'm just asking, he replied quickly. It wouldn't hurt to try something new. She nodded slowly. If it matters to you. The next day, Amina borrowed a dress from a neighbor. Something brighter, more modern. She styled her hair differently, hands trembling as she looked at her reflection. When Kofi saw her, he frowned. It doesn't suit you, he said flatly. Her shoulders dropped. Oh, just be yourself, he added, already reaching for his keys. She stood there long after he left the borrowed dress, suddenly feeling like a costume she wasn't meant to wear. Meanwhile, Lydia noticed everything. She noticed when Kofi lingered longer in conversation, when his phone lit up with messages he didn't answer in her presence, when his laughter sounded practiced instead of free. You're distracted lately, she said one evening, studying him. Work stress, he replied automatically. She smiled knowingly. Men usually say that when they're lying. Kofi laughed, but something in her tone made his heart race. The line between professional and personal blurred slowly, dangerously. A late-night drive turned into shared silence in a parked car. A hand brushed another. A look lasted too long. When it finally happened, the first kiss, it felt less like a choice and more like a surrender. Kofi went home that night carrying a weight he pretended not to feel. Amina sensed the change immediately. It wasn't the late nights anymore. It was the distance. The way Kofi avoided her eyes. The way he flinched when she touched his arm. Is there someone else? She asked one night, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. Kofi scoffed. Why would you even ask that? Because you're not here, she replied quietly. Not really. He stood up abruptly. You're imagining things. But Amina wasn't imagining anything. She noticed unfamiliar perfume on his clothes, noticed the sudden irritation in his voice when she spoke, noticed how he now spoke of my money instead of our money. One afternoon, Lydia decided to stop pretending. She showed up unannounced at Kofi's office, dressed impeccably, her presence commanding attention. Colleagues noticed. Whispers followed. Later, she smiled sweetly and said, You never told me your wife works nearby. Kofi's heart skipped. She doesn't. Oh, Lydia said lightly. I assume she would, considering your position. That word again, position. It echoed in Kofi's mind long after Lydia left. That evening, Kofi came home irritated, restless. Amina greeted him with dinner, but he barely touched it. Why are you always so small? He snapped suddenly. Amina looked up startled. Small. Your thinking. Your life. Everything he said pacing. I'm moving forward. You're stuck. Her eyes filled with tears. I stayed so you could move forward. That was your choice, he replied coldly. The room went silent. For the first time in their marriage, Amina felt something crack, not just pain, but clarity. Kofi no longer saw her sacrifices as love. He saw them as chains. Lydia, on the other hand, saw Kofi as potential, power, access. One night, she said the words that changed everything. "You deserve a life that matches who you are now," she whispered, "not who you used to be." Kofi didn't argue. At home, Amina lay awake beside a man who felt like a stranger staring at the ceiling as realization slowly took shape. Another woman had entered her marriage, and the man she loved was already halfway gone. The humiliation did not arrive all at once. It crept into Amina's life in small, cutting moments that left no visible scars, yet wounded her deeply. It began with silence. Kofi stopped coming home on time altogether. When he did, his answers were short, his patience thin. Amina learned to read his moods from the way he placed his keys on the table. Carefully meant a tolerable evening. Loudly meant she should stay quiet. Still she tried. She cooked his favorite meals, pressed his shirts, left encouraging notes in his bag, though she wasn't sure he ever read them. Love for her had never been about pride. One evening, as Amina prepared dinner, the doorbell rang. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened the door, a woman stood there. Tall, elegant, dressed in a way that made the narrow hallway feel suddenly smaller. Her perfume was unmistakable. "I'm looking for Kofi," Lydia said smoothly, her eyes already scanning the apartment. Amina's heart skipped. "He's not home yet. May I ask who you are?" Lydia smiled, not kindly, but confidently. "A colleague." She stepped inside without waiting for permission. Amina felt her throat tighten as Lydia looked around, taking in the modest furniture, the worn sofa, the neatly folded laundry on a chair. "So, this is where you live," Lydia said casually. "Yes," Amina replied, forcing calm into her voice. Lydia nodded as if confirming something to herself. "Interesting." The door opened moments later. Kofi froze when he saw Lydia standing in the living room. "What are you doing here?" he asked sharply. Lydia turned unbothered. "You weren't answering your phone. I thought I'd check." Amina watched the exchange, her heart pounding. "Who is she?" Kofi Amina asked quietly. Kofi hesitated just long enough for the truth to sink in. "She's from work," he said. Lydia laughed softly. "Is that all I am?" The room felt suddenly too small, the air too thin. "I'll wait outside," Lydia added, glancing at Amina. "You two probably need to talk." When she left, silence crashed down between husband and wife. Amina spoke first. "How long, Kofi?" Exhaled heavily, frustration replacing guilt. "Why does it matter?" Her voice trembled. "Because I'm your wife." "For now," he replied without thinking. The words struck like a slap. That night, nothing was resolved. Kofi slept on the couch. Amina cried quietly, careful not to wake him, though she wasn't sure that he would care if she did. From that moment on, Lydia stopped hiding. She called during dinner, sent messages late at night, showed up at events where Amina stood awkwardly beside Kofi, pretending not to see the looks exchanged between them. At one company gathering, Lydia approached Amina directly. "You must be Amina," she said warmly, extending a hand. Amina shook it, her grip weak. "I've heard a lot about you," Lydia continued, her smile never wavering. "Oh," Amina replied softly. "Yes. How supportive you've been." It's rare, Lydia added, her tone almost sympathetic. But times change. Amina didn't respond. She simply nodded and stepped away, her chest tight. On the drive home, she finally spoke. "You embarrassed me tonight," Kofi said abruptly. Amina stared out the window. "I didn't say anything." "You didn't have to," he snapped. "Your presence was enough." Her heart sank. "So now I'm a problem?" Kofi didn't answer. His silence was confirmation enough. Soon the insults grew sharper. "You don't understand this world. You wouldn't fit in where I'm going. You're holding me back." Each sentence chipped away at Amina's sense of self. Yet she remained, not because she was weak, but because she still believed marriage meant endurance. One afternoon, Lydia invited Kofi to lunch at an upscale restaurant. As they talked, she leaned closer. "You know," she said casually, "people already assume we're together." Kofi laughed nervously. "They shouldn't." "But they do," she replied, her eyes steady. "Maybe because it makes more sense." That word again, sense. Back home, Amina noticed a new distance in the bedroom. Kofi avoided intimacy, avoided conversation, avoided her. When she reached for his hand one night, he pulled away. "Please," she whispered, "talk to me." "There's nothing left to say," he replied coldly. Amina swallowed hard. "Then tell me what you want." Kofi stood up, anger flashing across his face. "I want my life back." She looked up at him. "We built that life together." He shook his head. "You helped. But this?" He gestured around the room. "This isn't me anymore." The next morning, Amina found Lydia sitting in their living room again, this time with Kofi's permission. "We need to be honest," Lydia said smoothly, crossing her legs. "This situation is unfair to everyone." Amina stood frozen. "To everyone?" "Yes," Lydia continued. "Kofi deserves happiness. You deserve peace." Kofi watched silently. Amina turned to him. "Is this what you think?" He avoided her eyes. "I can't keep living like this." Tears streamed down Amina's face. "Like what?" "With the woman who stood by you." His voice hardened. "With a past that won't let me move forward." That was the moment Amina understood. Her love had become an inconvenience. Her loyalty a burden. Her sacrifices a reminder he wanted erased. She picked up her bag slowly, hands shaking. "If you want me to leave," she said, voice breaking, "say it." Kofi met her eyes, and for the first time, there was no hesitation. "Leave," he said. The word echoed through the room, final and unforgiving. Amina stepped outside, her world collapsing behind her, unaware that the humiliation she endured would one day become the very fire that reshaped her destiny. The suitcase Amina carried was lighter than the weight pressing down on her chest. She stood just outside the building, the door closing behind her with a sound that felt final. For a moment, she didn't move. She simply stood there, listening to her own breathing, as if she needed proof that she was still alive. Inside, Kofi had already turned away. Lydia's hand rested lightly on his arm, a silent claim. The house that once echoed with quiet laughter now felt hollow. But he refused to acknowledge the emptiness. Amina walked. She didn't know where she was going. Her feet moved on instinct, carrying her through streets she had walked countless times before, though they now felt unfamiliar. People passed her without a second glance. To them, she was just another woman, with a bag another story they would never hear. She found a cheap guest house by evening, the kind that charged by the night, and asked no questions. The room smelled of damp walls and old linen. The mattress sagged in the middle. Amina sat on the bed and stared at the floor. This was it. No home, no husband, no certainty. She cried then, not loudly, not dramatically, but in quiet, shaking sobs that left her exhausted. When the tears finally slowed, she wiped her face and whispered a prayer. Let me survive this. Back at the house, Lydia poured herself a drink. It's done, she said, sounding almost relieved. Kofi nodded, though his chest felt tight. It had to happen. Of course, Lydia replied. Now you can focus on your future. That night, Kofi slept poorly. Images of Amina standing silently by the door replayed in his mind. Each time he turned over, guilt pressed harder against his ribs. By morning, he convinced himself it was for the best. Amina woke up stiff and sore. She washed her face in a small sink, staring at her reflection. Eyes, red skin dull, but still unmistakably her. She didn't allow herself to collapse. She went out early, walking the streets asking about work. Most people looked her over and shook their heads. Some offered pity. None offered opportunity. By afternoon, hunger clawed at her stomach. She spent the little money she had on bread and water, eating slowly on a bench as traffic roared past. Every sound felt too loud. Every face felt too close. That evening, she called a distant cousin. The line rang and rang before cutting off. Amina slipped the phone back into her bag. Hands trembling, days passed. She found small jobs cleaning, cooking, helping at a roadside food stall. The pay was barely enough to keep the guest house room. Still, she showed up early, worked hard, said thank you. At night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying moments from her marriage. The good ones hurt the most. Meanwhile, Kofi and Lydia stepped fully into their new life. They went out openly, dined in expensive restaurants, attended events where Lydia stood proudly by his side, her hand resting confidently on his arm. People congratulated him. "You've upgraded," one colleague joked. Kofi laughed, forcing himself to enjoy the approval. But the house felt different. Amina's absence lingered in small ways, the way the kitchen was too quiet in the mornings, the way the wardrobe felt emptier despite new clothes. Lydia filled the space with music and laughter, but something still echoed beneath it all. One night, Kofi opened a drawer and found a folded piece of paper. A note. "I hope one day you find peace with the man you were before the world taught you to be ashamed of him." He stared at it for a long time before shoving it back into the drawer. Out of sight, out of mind. For Amina, life narrowed to survival. She moved to an even cheaper room when she could no longer afford the guest house. The new place had no windows, just a small opening near the ceiling that let in stale air. She washed clothes by hand for neighbors, cooked for construction workers. Sometimes she went to bed hungry. Yet even in her lowest moments, she refused to beg. One afternoon, while scrubbing floors in a small office, she overheard two women talking. "Did you hear about Kofi?" one said. "He's doing well these days, married a smart, beautiful woman." Amina froze. "Not his old wife," the other laughed, "the new one." Her hands shook as she continued scrubbing the sound of laughter echoing in her ears. That night, she allowed herself to grieve, not just for the marriage, but for the years she had given the parts of herself she had silenced, the dreams she had set aside. She promised herself something then, never again. Meanwhile, cracks began to form in Kofi's new world. Lydia spent freely. She encouraged expensive habits, lavish gifts, weekend trips. "This is the life you deserve," she said. Kofi agreed at first, but bills piled up. Investments he barely understood demanded attention. Lydia brushed off concerns. "Money comes and goes," she laughed. "Relax." He tried. At work, whispers started. Performance slipped. Focus faded. He found himself snapping at colleagues, distracted by messages and expectations he couldn't meet. One evening, he came home exhausted only to find Lydia upset. "You forgot our reservation," she snapped. "I had a crisis at work," Kofi replied. She rolled her eyes. Excuses. For the first time, he felt something unsettling. Pressure. Not the quiet, supportive pressure Amina once carried with grace, but a demanding, restless force that gave nothing back. Still, he pushed the feeling aside. Amina, unaware of his growing unease, continued rebuilding herself piece by piece. She saved what little she could, took on extra work, learned to sleep through hunger, and in the silence of her small room, something inside her slowly hardened not into bitterness, but into resolve. She had been thrown out, but she was not broken. Amina used to think the worst pain in life was hunger. She was wrong. Hunger was cruel. Yes, it twisted. The stomach weakened. The knees made the world feel blurry at the edges. But humiliation burrowed deeper. It changed the way you walked, the way you spoke, the way you saw yourself when no one else was looking. After Kofi threw her out, Amina's world shrank into a handful of streets in Accra and a narrow room that smelled of sweat and damp cement. She rented the space from a woman who didn't ask questions, only demanded payment on time. "If you don't have it by Friday," the woman warned, "you'll sleep outside." Amina nodded, swallowing her fear. "I'll have it." She always said that, even when she wasn't sure how. Days began before sunrise. Amina would wrap her scarf tightly around her head, step into the cool morning air, and walk until she found work. Some days she cleaned offices. Other days she washed clothes for families who barely looked at her while handing over their dirty laundry. One woman once tossed a pile of clothing at her and said, "Don't steal anything. We know your type." Amina's face burned, but she lowered her eyes. "Yes, madam." Her pride had become a luxury she couldn't afford. At noon, she sometimes sat behind a food stall, waiting for the owner to finish selling so she could scrub pots and collect a few coins. The smell of fried fish and pepper sauce tormented her when she was hungry, but she kept working, her hands moving automatically. One afternoon, as she rinsed plates, the stall owner, an older woman named Auntie Afua, watched her closely. "You're not from the streets," Auntie Afua said. Amina paused, forcing a faint smile. "Life can change fast." Auntie Afua clicked her tongue. "That man who sent you away, he will regret it." Amina didn't answer. She didn't want pity. She didn't want anyone to carry her pain. But the truth was, the loneliness was eating her alive. At night, in her narrow room, the silence screamed louder than traffic. There was no familiar voice, no warm body beside her, no shared struggle, just Amina and the memories she couldn't escape. Some nights she replayed Kofi's words, leave. It was one word, but it had rewritten her entire life. She wondered what she had done wrong. Was she too simple, too quiet, too poor? Then she would remember the sewing machine she sold, the meals she skipped, so he could eat the prayers she whispered for him even when she was exhausted. And she would realize she hadn't been too little. He had been too hollow. Still knowing that didn't stop the pain. One evening, Amina left work late and walked back through a crowded market. The air smelled of roasted corn and sweat. Men shouted prices. Motorbikes weaved through pedestrians. As she squeezed between stalls, she heard her name. Amina. Her heart jumped. She turned and saw an old neighbor from her previous area, a woman named Nana Amma. Nana Amma's eyes widened with recognition, then narrowed with suspicion. "Is it really you?" Nana Amma asked loudly. "Ah, so it's true. Kofi really chased you away?" People nearby glanced over. Amina's stomach tightened. Nana Amma leaned closer, voice lowering, but still sharp. "What did you do? A man doesn't throw away his wife like that unless she did something." Amina's throat closed. "I didn't do anything." Nana Amma scoffed. "That's what they all say." Amina felt heat rise behind her eyes. Not tears anger, but she swallowed it. "I have to go," she whispered, pushing past. As she walked away, she heard Nana Amma's voice behind her, still loud enough for strangers to hear. "I women these days. You don't know how to keep a husband." Amina's legs trembled, but she kept walking, refusing to run. Because running would mean she accepted the shame. She didn't. That night, she sat on the floor of her room, her back against the wall, and pressed her hands to her mouth to keep from screaming. How could people judge her without knowing her story? How could the world treat a discarded woman like she was trash? The next morning, she woke with swollen eyes and a new kind of numbness. She washed her face, tied her scarf, and went out again. Work, pay, survive. That became her entire life. Then came the day she truly hit the bottom. It was a Friday. She had only half the rent. Amina had worked 3 jobs that week, but payment was delayed. One employer claimed they didn't have cash. Another promised tomorrow. Tomorrow never came. She stood in front of her landlord's door money in her palm, heart pounding. "Please," she said when the woman opened, "I have half today. I'll bring the rest in 2 days." The landlord's expression hardened. "No." Amina's voice cracked. "I'm trying." "I don't care," the woman snapped. "Trying doesn't pay my bills." She grabbed Amina's bag and shoved it toward her. "Leave." Amina froze. The hallway swayed. Her ears rang. "Please," she begged, her knees weakening. "Just 2 days." The landlord pointed outside. "Go." Amina stumbled down the stairs, carrying her bag, her throat tight. People watched. No one spoke. In the street, she sat on the curb, staring at nothing. She had no place to go. No family close enough. No friends brave enough to host a problem woman. No money for another room. For the first time, the thought of giving up crept into her mind. Then, as she sat there, a child approached a little boy, selling sachet water. He looked at her face. then at the bag, then back at her eyes. "Auntie?" he asked softly. "Are you sick?" Amina shook her head slowly. "No." The boy reached into his basket and handed her a sachet of water. "Take. It's okay." Amina stared at it, stunned. "I can't pay you," she whispered. He shrugged. "It's small, small." That word hit her chest like a light in darkness. In a world that had thrown her away, a child with almost nothing had still chosen kindness. Amina accepted the water. Her hands trembled as she drank, tears finally falling. Not because she was weak, but because somewhere deep inside her, hope had refused to die. That night, Auntie Afua found her sitting outside the stall after closing. "You can sleep in my back room," Auntie Afua said firmly. "Just for now." Amina tried to protest. Auntie Afua cut her off. "No shame. Tomorrow you'll work. We move step by step." Amina nodded, unable to speak. As she lay on a thin mat behind the stall, listening to the distant city sounds, she whispered into the dark, "I will rise again." She didn't know how. She didn't know when. But she knew one thing for sure. Kofi had thrown her out, believing she would disappear. He had no idea he had just pushed her toward a destiny far bigger than both of them. Destiny rarely arrives with noise. When it finally came for Amina, it came quietly through a ringing phone she almost didn't answer. She was standing behind Auntie Afua's food stall, wiping down a wooden table at the end of a long day. Her back ached. Her fingers were raw from scrubbing. The smell of charcoal and pepper still clung to her clothes. Her phone vibrated inside her bag. Amina frowned. No one called her anymore. Not friends, not family. Everyone who knew her story either pitied her too much or judged her too harshly. She let it ring once, then again. Something instinct perhaps made her stop what she was doing and reach for it. "Hello," she said cautiously. There was a brief pause on the other end. Then a calm, professional voice spoke. "Good evening. Am I speaking with Miss Amina Mensah?" Her heart skipped. "Yes, this is Amina. My name is Mr. Daniel Owusu. I'm calling from Owusu and Partners Legal Chambers. This call is regarding the estate of the late Madame Evelyn Mensah." Amina's breath caught. Madame Evelyn? The name stirred something distant and fragile in her memory. A woman with soft hands and a quiet laugh. A relative her mother once spoke of in hushed, respectful tones. A woman who had moved away many years ago and was rarely mentioned after. "I'm sorry," Amina said slowly. "I think you have the wrong person." "We don't," the man replied gently. "You are listed as her closest living next of kin." Amina laughed softly, not from amusement, but disbelief. "Sir," she said, lowering her voice, "I clean tables for a living. If this is a joke—" "It isn't," Mr. Owusu interrupted kindly. "Madame Evelyn passed away 3 weeks ago. She left specific instructions for us to locate you." Amina's knees weakened. She grabbed the edge of the table to steady herself. I didn't even know she was still alive," she whispered. "That is understandable," the lawyer said. "She lived a very private life, but she never forgot you." The words felt unreal. Auntie Afua noticed Amina's expression and came closer, concern etched on her face. Amina raised a trembling finger signaling she needed a moment. "When can we meet, Mr. Owusu?" asked. Amina swallowed. "I don't have money for—" "The firm will cover transportation," he said calmly. "Please, it is important." After the call ended, Amina stood frozen, phone pressed to her chest. Auntie Efua touched her arm. "What happened?" "I don't know," Amina replied honestly, "but something strange." That night, Amina barely slept. Her mind raced with questions. Why would a distant relative leave anything for her? Why now? Why after everything had fallen apart? Hope, she reminded herself, was dangerous. It had hurt her before. Still, she couldn't stop imagining. The next morning, she borrowed a clean dress from Auntie Efua and carefully braided her hair. She looked at herself in the small mirror behind the stall, still thin, still tired, but standing straighter than she had in weeks. The law office was in a quiet part of the city, far from the noise and dust she was used to. The building was modern, polished, intimidating. Amina felt out of place immediately. Inside, the air smelled of paper and air conditioning. People in crisp clothes walked past her, barely glancing her way. She clutched her bag tightly. Mr. Owusu was a middle-aged man with kind eyes. He greeted her warmly and led her into a private office. "I know this must feel overwhelming," he said, motioning for her to sit. "But please take your time." He placed a file on the table and opened it slowly. Madame Evelyn Mensah, he began, was a very successful investor. She made her fortune through real estate mining shares and long-term holdings across several African markets. Amina stared at him blankly. "I don't understand," she said quietly. Mr. Owusu nodded. "She had no children, no spouse. You were her sister's granddaughter." "My mother's aunt, Amina," whispered the memory, sharpening. "Yes," he confirmed. "She followed your life from a distance. She knew about your marriage and about your separation." Amina's face flushed with embarrassment. "Everyone knows now." "She admired your resilience," the lawyer said softly. "In fact, she updated her will less than a year before her passing." He slid a document toward her. Amina's eyes scanned the page, her vision blurring as the numbers began to register. She blinked once, then again. "Sir," she said, her voice barely audible, "this must be a mistake." "It is not," Mr. Owusu replied gently. "You are the sole beneficiary of her estate." Amina's breath caught painfully in her chest. The figure printed on the page made no sense. It felt like a foreign language. $300 million. She shook her head, pushing the paper away. "No, I can't accept this. I don't even know her." "You knew her blood," the lawyer replied, "and she knew your character." Tears welled in Amina's eyes. "I was thrown out of my house," she whispered. "I slept on the floor. I begged for work." Mr. Owusu leaned forward. "And yet you didn't steal. You didn't destroy. You didn't harden your heart." Amina broke down, then covering her face as sobs shook her body. For weeks, she had cried from pain. This time, she cried from shock, from disbelief, from the terrifying realization that her life was about to change forever. It took hours to explain everything. The legal process, the assets, the protections. Amina barely heard half of it. All she could think was, "Kofi threw me away like nothing." And now this. When she finally stepped outside, The sun felt too bright. The street noise too loud. She sat on a bench and breathed deeply. Her phone buzzed again. A text message from a number she didn't recognize. Have you thought about reconciliation? She stared at the message. Kofi. Word of Lydia's impatience and his financial strain had already begun to reach him, and now, instinctively, he felt something slipping. Amina didn't reply. For the first time since the night she was thrown out, she felt something powerful rise inside her. Not revenge, not pride, control. She slipped the phone back into her bag and stood up. The woman Kofi discarded had just inherited a future he could never take from her, and she had a choice now. Amina didn't answer Kofi's message. Not because she was trying to punish him. Not because she felt powerful in that moment, but because for the first time in a long while she needed silence, real silence to think. She returned to Auntie Efua's stall that evening, her mind still spinning. The city felt the same, yet different. The noise, the dust, the familiar smells all unchanged. But inside her, something had shifted. Auntie Efua took one look at her face and frowned. You look like someone who saw a ghost, she said. Amina sat down slowly. Or maybe someone who woke up from a bad dream. She didn't explain. Not yet. The news felt too fragile, too unreal to be spoken aloud. That night, she lay awake behind the stall, staring into the darkness. The number echoed in her mind. $300 million. It felt obscene to even think it. How could a woman who had begged for 2 more days to pay rent suddenly hold such wealth in her name? Fear crept in. What if it wasn't real? What if something went wrong? What if she lost herself? By morning, she had made a decision. She returned to the law office. Mr. Owusu welcomed her again, unsurprised by her urgency. I need to understand everything, Amina said firmly. Not just the money, the responsibility. The lawyer nodded, clearly impressed. That's wise. For hours, they went through documents, asset structures, trusts, safeguards, properties in multiple African cities, long-term investments, corporate shares, charitable foundations already established in Madame Evelyn's name. She was very intentional, Mr. Owusu explained. She didn't just build wealth, she built systems. Amina listened carefully, asking questions, taking notes. She wasn't dazzled. She was cautious. Why me? She asked quietly at one point. There are others more educated, more qualified. Mr. Owusu leaned back. Madame Evelyn believed character mattered more than credentials. She wrote that herself. He slid a handwritten letter across the desk. Amina's hands trembled as she opened it. My dear Amina, if you are reading this, it means I am gone. I watched your life from afar. Not because I didn't care, but because I wanted to see who you would become without interference. You chose kindness when the world rewarded cruelty. You chose dignity when shame was easier. Wealth amplifies who we already are. I trust you to use it well. Tears fell onto the page. In that moment, Amina understood something important. This inheritance was not an escape. It was a test. Over the next few days, Amina did something unexpected. She didn't move. She didn't buy anything. She didn't tell anyone. She continued working at the stall. She continued washing dishes, serving customers, scrubbing tables. Auntie Efua noticed. You're quieter, the older woman said one evening. But stronger. Amina smiled faintly. I'm learning. Meanwhile, Kofi was unraveling. Lydia's patience was thinning fast. She complained about money, about his long hours, about promises that seemed increasingly empty. "You said this deal would fix everything," she snapped one night, tossing her phone onto the couch. "I'm working on it," Kofi replied sharply. "Working isn't enough anymore," Lydia said coldly. "Results matter. At work, pressure mounted. A risky investment he'd approved began to falter. Colleagues whispered. His boss questioned his judgment. For the first time since Amina left, Kofi felt truly alone. He thought of her then, not the quiet woman he'd dismissed, but the steady presence who once absorbed pressure without complaint. He sent another message. "We should talk." No reply. Days passed. Then one afternoon, Kofi received an invitation to a private business luncheon. The location was exclusive. The guest list impressive. Desperate to salvage his standing, he attended. When he arrived, the room buzzed with quiet conversation. Executives, investors, decision makers. And then he saw her. Amina stood near the front, speaking calmly with a group of senior figures. She wore a simple but elegant dress. Nothing flashy, nothing loud. Yet the room seemed to lean toward her. Kofi froze. At first he thought he was mistaken, but as she turned slightly, he saw her face clearly. Amina, composed, confident, untouchable. His heart pounded violently in his chest. "What is she doing here?" he whispered to a colleague. The man raised an eyebrow. "You don't know what?" "That's Amina Mensah," the colleague replied. "She's the new principal beneficiary of the Evelyn Mensah estate. Word is, she controls over $300 million. The room spun. Kofi felt his knees weaken. "That's impossible," he murmured. The colleague laughed. "Trust me, everyone's talking about her. She's moving quietly, but very deliberately." Kofi watched as Amina shook hands with people who had once barely acknowledged him. They listened when she spoke. They leaned in. She wasn't performing. She belonged. Shame crashed over him in waves. This was the woman he had called small. This was the woman he had thrown out. When their eyes finally met across the room, time seemed to slow. Amina didn't smile. She didn't frown. She simply looked at him calmly, neutrally, and then turned back to her conversation. That indifference hurt more than anger ever could. Kofi excused himself and stepped outside, gasping for air. Everything made sense now. The unanswered messages, the silence, the distance. He hadn't just lost his wife. He had misjudged her worth and paid the price. Inside, Amina felt her own wave of emotion. Not triumph, not revenge, closure. She had worried about how it would feel to see him again. She had feared anger, bitterness, pain. But standing there, she felt only clarity. She had survived the worst without him. And now, she would shape her future without his shadow. As the luncheon continued, Amina spoke briefly about her plans, sustainable investments, ethical leadership, community development. People nodded. Some took notes. Outside, Kofi sat alone, staring at the pavement. For the first time in his life, he understood a brutal truth. He didn't lose Amina because she was poor. He lost her because he didn't recognize her value until the world did. Power didn't announce itself when Amina stepped into it. It didn't arrive with loud celebrations or dramatic changes. It came quietly, settling into her spine, like a new posture she had to learn to hold. After the luncheon, Amina returned to her small room behind Auntie Afua's stall. She removed her shoes, folded her dress carefully, and sat on the thin mat, breathing deeply. Everything outside had changed. Inside, she was still herself. The following week marked the official transfer of authority. Trusts were activated. Accounts secured. Legal protections finalized. The estate was now undeniably hers. $300 million. The number still felt unreal. Mr. Owusu recommended private security luxury housing and immediate relocation. Amina declined, at least for now. I want to understand the weight of what I hold, she said, before I let it carry me. Instead, she requested something else. Education. She enrolled in private executive courses, finance leadership, corporate governance, held discreetly with instructors who didn't care about gossip or status. She listened more than she spoke. She asked questions others were too proud to ask, and she learned quickly. Every lesson sharpened her clarity. Wealth, she realized, was not freedom by default. It was responsibility amplified. Amina began restructuring parts of the estate. She sold assets that conflicted with her values, invested in long-term projects that aligned with sustainability, employment, and community growth. She created jobs. She paid fair wages. She insisted on transparency. People noticed. She's different, they said. Not reckless. Not loud. Just, solid. Meanwhile, Kofi spiraled. After the luncheon, he couldn't stop replaying the image of Amina standing among powerful people, untouched by his presence. Lydia noticed his distraction immediately. You didn't come home last night, she said sharply. I needed space, Kofi replied. You always need space now, she snapped. What's wrong with you? He didn't answer. At work, his reputation continued to erode. The failed investment became public. His superiors demanded explanations he struggled to provide. Confidence, the borrowed kind, deserted him. He sent Amina another message. I was wrong. No response. Days passed. Weeks. Amina stayed focused. She moved out of the back room at the stall only after securing housing for Auntie Efua and upgrading the food business into a proper restaurant with stable income and staff. This is too much. Auntie Efua protested, tears in her eyes. It's not, Amina replied gently. It's return. She visited communities quietly, without cameras or speeches. She funded clinics, schools, vocational programs. People didn't know her story. They didn't need to. One evening, Mr. Reshiru Owusu informed her of an unavoidable event, a high-profile charity gala, where she would be publicly acknowledged as the estate's principal. I'll attend, Amina said, but on my terms. The gala took place in a grand hall filled with light and whispers. Amina arrived alone. She wore a simple gown, elegant but unassuming. No excessive jewelry, no dramatic entrance. Still heads turned. When she stepped onto the stage to speak, the room fell silent. She didn't talk about money. She talked about dignity. Power doesn't come from how much you control, she said calmly. It comes from how much you protect. Applause followed, sincere, not forced. In the crowd, Kofi stood frozen. He hadn't planned to attend, But Lydia insisted. She wanted to be seen. When Amina's name was announced, Lydia leaned forward eagerly. Then she saw Kofi's face. "Do you know her?" Lydia whispered. Kofi swallowed. "She's my wife." Silence. "What?" Lydia laughed. "Don't be ridiculous." "She was," he said quietly. Lydia stared at him, realization dawning. "You mean?" "The woman you threw out Kofi didn't respond." Lydia's expression hardened. After the event, she confronted him. "You lied to me," she hissed. "I didn't know." Kofi replied, his voice hollow. "That makes it worse," Lydia snapped. "You discarded a woman like that, and now she's worth more than both of us combined." The words stung, but Kofi didn't argue. Lydia packed her bags that night. "I didn't sign up to lose," she said coldly. "I signed up to win." The door closed behind her with the same finality Amina once felt. Kofi was alone again. This time, truly. He watched Amina from a distance in news articles, quiet reports, whispers of her influence. She never mentioned him, never acknowledged him. And that hurt more than public humiliation ever could. For Amina, life settled into rhythm. Work, study, purpose. She allowed herself small joys, morning walks, reading at night, moments of laughter with people who didn't want anything from her. She also allowed herself boundaries. When Kofi finally managed to secure a meeting through a mutual contact, she agreed, not out of weakness, but closure. They met in a quiet cafe. Kofi arrived early, hands shaking. When Amina walked in, he stood instinctively. "Thank you for coming," he said. She nodded and sat. "You asked to talk." He struggled for words. "I made a terrible mistake," he said finally. "I was blind. I was arrogant. Amina raised a hand gently. "I'm not here to revisit the past," she said. "I'm here to acknowledge it." Kofi's voice broke. "I want to fix things." She met his eyes steadily. "Some things aren't meant to be fixed. They're meant to be learned from." Silence stretched between them. "You didn't break me," she added softly. "You revealed me." Kofi lowered his head. Amina stood. "Take care of yourself." And she left. As she walked away, she felt no triumph, only peace. She had stepped fully into her power, not because she had money, but because she no longer needed validation from the man who once couldn't see her worth. Kofi's world collapsed quietly, not with scandal, not with headlines, but with absence. After Lydia left the house, felt cavernous. Her laughter, once sharp and constant, was gone. The music stopped. The perfume faded. What remained was silence, thick, accusing, impossible to escape. For the first time in years, Kofi woke up with no one to impress, no one to perform for, and no one to blame. At work, the consequences he had postponed finally arrived. The failed investment was no longer a rumor. It was a confirmed loss. Senior management called an emergency review. Meetings that once welcomed his voice now scrutinized it. "Your judgment has been inconsistent," his supervisor said bluntly. "You took risks without adequate assessment." Kofi tried to defend himself, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. By the end of the week, he was removed from leadership on several projects. His salary was reduced. His influence, the very thing he had sacrificed his marriage for, began to evaporate. He went home that night and sat in the dark. For the first time, he remembered the early days with Amina, not selectively, not defensively, but honestly. He remembered her waking before dawn, her hands rough from work, the way she smiled even when she was exhausted. He had mistaken her quiet strength for weakness. Now, without her, he felt fragile. Meanwhile, Amina's days were full, but not chaotic. She moved with intention. Her team grew carefully chosen. She avoided those drawn only to wealth or proximity to power. She trusted slowly. She listened deeply. One afternoon, a young woman approached her after a community meeting. "You don't talk like other wealthy people," the woman said nervously. "You talk like someone who's been here." Amina smiled. "Because I have." That night, she reflected on how close she had come to losing herself to bitterness. How easy it would have been to weaponize her success against Kofi. But that wasn't who she wanted to be. Power, without purpose, was just noise. Kofi, on the other hand, spiraled. With Lydia gone, he had no distraction, no illusion of progress, no applause to drown out his thoughts. He started drinking more, sleeping less, avoiding calls he couldn't answer. Friends who once admired him grew distant. Invitations stopped coming. One evening, he ran into an old colleague at a bar. "Kofi," the man said awkwardly. "Long time." They exchanged pleasantries before the conversation drifted into uncomfortable territory. "People talk," the colleague added cautiously. "They say you lost everything chasing the wrong things." Kofi forced a laugh. "People always talk." "Yes," the man replied, "but sometimes they're right." The words stayed with him. Later that night, Kofi walked home alone. The city lights felt colder now, harsher. He passed places he and Amina once walked together. Cheap restaurants, crowded streets, memories he had erased when they were inconvenient. Guilt settled heavily in his chest. He had believed success meant escape, but what he had escaped from was love. Weeks later, Kofi received official notice. His contract would not be renewed. He stared at the letter for a long time, unable to process it. Unemployed. The word terrified him more than poverty ever had. He had built his identity on progress status, forward motion. Without it, he felt empty, exposed. He thought of Amina again. Not as the wealthy woman the world now admired, but as the steady presence who had once believed in him when he had nothing to offer. He showed up at her office unannounced one morning, desperation outweighing pride. The receptionist stopped him politely. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," he admitted, "but I need to see her." The woman glanced at a screen, then back at him. "She's in a meeting." "Please," Kofi said quietly. "Tell her I'm here." Minutes stretched painfully. Finally, the receptionist returned. "She says she can spare 5 minutes." Kofi's heart raced. Amina entered the room calmly dressed simply, her expression unreadable. "Kofi," she said, "what do you want?" The directness startled him. "I lost my job," he blurted out. "Everything's falling apart." Amina nodded once. "I'm sorry to hear that." That's all he asked bitterly. "After everything?" She looked at him steadily. "What response are you expecting?" "I don't know," he whispered. "Help, maybe." "Forgiveness." Amina took a breath. "I forgave you a long time ago. Forgiveness is for me. Help is different." He flinched. I can't save you from the consequences of your choices, she continued gently. Just like no one saved me when you sent me away. Silence filled the room. I loved you, Kofi said, tears welling. I still do. Amina's voice softened, but her resolve did not. I loved you too, she replied. But love doesn't survive disrespect. She stood. I wish you strength, but you must rebuild your life yourself. Kofi nodded slowly, humiliation washing over him. As he left her office, he understood something he hadn't before. Amina's success wasn't what separated them. Her growth was. She had moved forward without him. And now he was the one left behind. That evening, Kofi sat alone in his house, surrounded by furniture that felt foreign. He thought about pride, about ambition, about the cost of confusing validation with worth. For the first time, he accepted responsibility, not to reclaim Amina, but to face himself. Amina, unaware of the depth of his reckoning, closed her office for the day and walked home in peace. She cooked a simple meal, read a book, and slept soundly. She no longer carried his failures. She had learned the hardest lesson of all. You cannot heal someone who refuses to confront who they've become. Time has a way of humbling those who once believed they were untouchable. For Kofi, that time came slowly, then all at once. After losing his job, days blended into each other. He woke up late, aimless, scrolling through messages that never came. The phone that once buzzed with meetings, deals, and invitations now lay silent beside him. He sold his car first, then a few watches, then furniture. Each sale chipped away at the image he had worked so hard to build, and with every item gone, he felt closer to the man he had tried so desperately to outrun, the man who once counted coins for oranges. Only this time there was no Amina beside him. Meanwhile, Amina's life moved forward with quiet precision. She had relocated to a modest but secure home, nothing extravagant, nothing meant to impress. She hosted strategy meetings in calm spaces, not towering offices. She insisted on walking through communities rather than observing them from behind tinted windows. People began to trust her, not because of her wealth, but because of her presence. One afternoon, while visiting a vocational center she had recently funded, Amina overheard two women talking nearby. Did you hear about Kofi? One whispered. Amina froze, not outwardly, but inside. They say he's struggling badly. The other replied, lost his job, lost everything. Amina felt a familiar tightening in her chest. Not satisfaction, concern. That surprised her. She had expected indifference by now, or distance, or even bitterness. Instead, she felt something more complicated. Compassion, carefully guarded. That evening, she sat alone on her balcony watching the city lights flicker. Memories surfaced uninvited. Not the cruelty, not the betrayal, but the early days. The laughter, the shared struggle. She reminded herself why she had left, why she hadn't turned back. Still, she wondered. Kofi, unaware of her thoughts, reached his lowest point days later. He had spent his last money on rent. The landlord knocked early the next morning. You're 3 months behind, the man said bluntly. I can't wait anymore. Kofi nodded, numb. I understand. He packed his remaining belongings into a single bag the same way Amina once had. As he stepped outside, The irony struck him with brutal clarity. He walked the streets aimlessly, his phone clutched in his hand. Finally, with nothing left to lose, he sent one last message. I don't want money. I don't want favors. I just want to talk as human beings. Amina read the message hours later. She stared at it for a long time. She remembered the night she had begged him for 2 more days. The night he had looked at her without hesitation and said leave. Her instinct was to ignore him. But something else stirred. Closure, perhaps. Or proof to herself that she was no longer the woman who needed his approval. She replied, tomorrow, 1 hour, public place. Kofi exhaled in relief. He didn't know he was holding. They met at a small park neutral ground. No power imbalance. No grand entrances. When Kofi arrived, he barely recognized himself. His clothes were worn. His shoulders slumped. The confidence he once wore like armor had long since cracked. Amina arrived calmly, dressed simply, her posture steady. For a moment, they just looked at each other. You look well, Kofi said quietly. So do you, Amina replied, though they both knew it wasn't true. They sat. Silence stretched between them, heavy but honest. I don't know where to start, Kofi admitted. You don't have to start anywhere, Amina said. Just speak. He swallowed hard. I was afraid of being small, he said, and I punished you for reminding me where I came from. Amina listened without interruption. I thought power would erase my insecurity, he continued. Instead, it exposed it. She nodded once. I'm not asking you to take me back, Kofi said quickly. I know I don't deserve that. Amina met his eyes. Then what are you asking? Understanding, he whispered. Not forgiveness, just understanding. She considered his words carefully. You broke me once, she said softly. Not because you left, but because you made me believe my worth depended on your approval. Kofi's eyes filled with tears. I know. But here's the truth, she continued. I rebuilt myself without you, and that's why I can sit here now without anger. He nodded, ashamed. I don't need your money, he said again. I need to learn how to live with myself. Amina believed him, not because he was persuasive, but because he finally sounded honest. She stood slowly. This is where our story ends, she said, not with revenge, not with reconciliation, but with truth. Kofi stood as well. Thank you for seeing me, even now. Amina paused, then spoke one final time. I see you, she said, but I choose myself. She walked away without looking back. Kofi sat alone on the bench, long after she left the weight of his choices, pressing down on him, but for the first time without resentment. That night, Amina slept peacefully. She had confronted the past and found it no longer held power over her. She hadn't won. She had healed. And sometimes that is the greatest victory of all. The city didn't change after that meeting in the park. Cars still honked. Vendors still shouted prices. Life went on the way it always had. But for both Amina and Kofi, something irreversible had shifted. For Kofi, the days that followed were the hardest of his life, not because he had nothing, but because he could no longer lie to himself. He found a temporary place to sleep in a shared compound on the edge of the city. The room was small, hot, and poorly lit. At night, He lay on a thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, replaying moments he once dismissed as insignificant. Amina, waking up before dawn. Amina, counting money carefully. Amina, smiling even when she was exhausted. He realized now that what he had called small thinking was actually discipline. What he had seen as weakness was patience, and what he had mistaken for dependence was quiet strength. The truth arrived like a bruise, slow, painful, undeniable. Kofi began looking for work, not the kind of work he once felt entitled to, but any honest opportunity. He walked into offices with his head-lowered CV in hand, prepared to be judged. Most places turned him away. "You're overqualified," some said. Others said nothing at all. One construction company finally offered him a short-term supervisory role. Nothing glamorous, nothing secure. Just a chance. The pay was modest, the hours long, the environment unforgiving. But Kofi accepted. Every day he arrived early. He listened more than he spoke. He learned to take instructions from people younger than him without resentment. At night, his body ached a different kind of pain than the one he carried inside. But for the first time in months, he slept. Slowly, something changed. Not his status, his humility. Meanwhile, Amina continued building her life with careful intention. She had learned something important during her fall, and Rise money could protect you, but it could also isolate you. She was determined not to let that happen. She kept her circle small. She avoided flattery. She invested in people, not praise. One evening during a strategic review, a senior advisor asked her bluntly, "Why don't you use your story more publicly? It could strengthen your influence." Amina considered the suggestion. Then she shook her head. "My story is not a weapon," she said calmly. "It's a foundation." She focused instead on long-term impact funding, women-owned businesses, offering leadership training for those who had never imagined themselves in boardrooms, creating safe spaces for women discarded by society. Women like the person she used to be. One afternoon, while visiting a support center, a young woman approached her, eyes nervous. "My husband threw me out," the woman whispered. "I heard you might understand." Amina sat with her for over an hour. She didn't offer solutions right away. She listened. That night, Amina returned home emotionally drained, but deeply grounded. She realized something profound. Her pain had not been wasted. It had been transformed. Across the city, Kofi struggled through his own transformation. One afternoon, after weeks of physical labor and quiet endurance, his supervisor pulled him aside. "You work differently than before," the man said. "Less ego." Kofi nodded. "I had to lose it." The man studied him. "If you keep this up, there may be something more permanent." Kofi felt a flicker of hope, cautious, humble earned. That evening, he sat outside his room, watching the sun dip below the rooftops. For the first time in a long while, he didn't reach for his phone to check if Amina had called. He understood now. She wasn't coming back. And that was okay. What mattered was who he became without her. Weeks later, Amina attended a closed-door business forum focused on ethical leadership in Africa. The room was filled with influential figures, some powerful, some performative. When Amina spoke, she didn't dominate the conversation. She anchored it. During a break, a man approached her. "I knew your husband," once he said casually. "He was ambitious." Amina met his eyes calmly. "People change." The man nodded. "Yes, some learn, some don't." Amina excused herself, unbothered. She had learned that her story didn't need defending. It needed living. Later that night, Amina received an email forwarded by Mr. Owusu. It was a proposal for a regional initiative aimed at economic rehabilitation for professionals who had fallen due to ethical failure or personal collapse. She read it carefully. At the bottom of the proposal was a handwritten note scanned into the document. Second chances should require humility, not entitlement. Amina closed her laptop and leaned back. She thought of Kofi, not with longing, not with regret, but with clarity. The next day, she approved the initiative with strict guidelines. No favoritism, no shortcuts. Opportunity without exemption. She never told Kofi, and she didn't need to. Months passed. The city moved through seasons. Dry heat, sudden rain, renewal. One afternoon, Amina received an update report. One line caught her attention. Project Site Supervisor Kofi Mensah. She paused. Just for a second. Then she nodded and continued reading. Kofi, unaware that Amina had seen his name worked tirelessly on the site. He didn't know who approved funding. He didn't ask. He was just grateful to work. One evening, as he walked home, he passed a billboard advertising leadership and resilience. The image was simple. No faces, no names, just words. Your past does not define your future, but it teaches you how to earn it. Kofi stopped and stared. He felt tears sting his eyes, not from loss, from understanding. Elsewhere, Amina stood on her balcony, watching the city breathe beneath her. She thought about forgiveness, not as something given to others, but as something claimed for oneself. She had forgiven Kofi, not to bring him back into her life, but to release the last weight he carried in her heart. Her life no longer revolved around what had been taken from her. It was anchored in what she chose to build, and that more than money, more than status, more than vindication, was the truest form of wealth she had ever known. By the time the rains returned to the city, both Amina and Kofi had become different people, not because life had been kind, but because it had been honest. For Amina, success no longer felt like something fragile she had to protect. It felt rooted, earned, quietly solid. Her days were full, but not frantic. Meetings ended on time. Decisions were deliberate. When problems arose, she faced them without panic. She had learned through loss that nothing was permanent, not even pain. One afternoon, she stood in a large, unfinished building on the outskirts of the city. It was dusty, noisy, filled with the sound of hammering and shouted instructions. This was one of the largest projects funded by her initiative, a vocational and rehabilitation center designed to train professionals who had fallen from stable careers and needed a second chance. Amina wore a simple hard hat and flat shoes. No entourage, no cameras. She walked slowly, observing. Madame, a project coordinator, said nervously, hurrying beside her, "We didn't expect you today." "I was in the area," Amina replied calmly. "I wanted to see how things are going." They passed groups of workers, carrying materials, measuring walls, reviewing plans. Most barely noticed her. Then she saw him. Kofi stood near a concrete pillar, reviewing documents with two junior supervisors. His clothes were plain dust clinging to his trousers. His face looked thinner, older. But there was something different in the way he stood, grounded, attentive. He was listening. Amina stopped walking. The coordinator followed her gaze and stiffened slightly. "That's one of the site supervisors," he said carefully. "Very hard-working. Keeps his head down." Amina nodded. "I can see that." Kofi hadn't noticed her yet. She watched him quietly for a moment, not with nostalgia, not with longing, but with detached curiosity. This man, once obsessed with appearances, now measured success in completed tasks and earned respect. Eventually, one of the supervisors turned and froze. "Sir," the man whispered urgently, It's her." Kofi turned. Their eyes met across the dusty space. The world did not stop. Hammers continued to strike. Workers continued to move. But something subtle shifted between them. Kofi's heart jumped painfully into his throat. He straightened instinctively, then stopped himself. No posturing, no performance, just honesty. Amina walked toward him, her steps slow and measured. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice calm. "Good afternoon," Kofi replied, his voice rough but steady. Neither smiled, neither looked away. "I didn't know you worked here," she said. "I didn't know you funded this," he replied honestly. She nodded. "Now we both know." Silence stretched, not uncomfortable, just real. "I hope the work has been fair," Amina added. Kofi met her eyes. "It has. Strict, demanding, fair." She nodded again. "That's the point." One of the supervisors shifted awkwardly. "Should we give you a moment?" Amina glanced at Kofi. "If that's okay." He hesitated for half a second, then nodded. "Yes." They walked a short distance away, stopping near an open window frame where fresh air flowed through. Neither of them spoke immediately. Finally, Kofi broke the silence. "I didn't know you would ever see me like this," he said quietly. Amina folded her arms loosely. "Like what?" "Stripped of excuses," he replied. "Just a man working." She studied him. "That's not something to be ashamed of." He nodded. "I know that now." He took a breath. "I want you to know I didn't ask for this job because of you." "I didn't even know." "I believe you," Amina said. The sincerity in her voice surprised him. "I'm not trying to come back into your life," Kofi added quickly. "I just wanted to say thank you. Not for the opportunity, for the boundary." Amina raised an eyebrow slightly. "The boundary, yes," he said. "You didn't save me. You let me face myself." That changed everything. She considered his words carefully. "You did the work," she said. "I just didn't interfere." A gust of wind blew dust through the window, carrying the smell of cement and rain. Kofi swallowed. "I hurt you." "Yes," Amina replied gently. "I'll carry that," he said. "Not as punishment, as memory." Amina held his gaze. "That's enough." For the first time, his eyes filled not with desperation, but with release. "I'm glad you're well," he said. "I am," she replied, and she meant it. They stood there for a moment longer, two people bound by a past that no longer controlled them. Then Amina stepped back. "I won't stay long," she said, "but I wanted to tell you something." Kofi nodded, bracing himself. "You don't owe me anything." Amina continued. not loyalty, not repayment, not guilt. He frowned slightly. Live well, she said. That's all. Kofi exhaled shakily. I'm trying. I can see that she replied. They shared one final look. Not romantic, not bitter, not unfinished. Complete. Amina turned and walked away. Kofi watched her go, his chest tight, not with longing, but with something close to gratitude. For the first time, he didn't wish things were different. He wished only that he would continue becoming better. As Amina left the site, the coordinator hurried to catch up. Do you want us to make any changes regarding personnel? He asked cautiously. Amina shook her head. No, merit stands. That evening, Amina returned home as rain began to fall. She stood by her window, watching the city soften under the downpour. She thought about the woman she used to be standing in the rain with a suitcase abandoned and confused. She thought about the woman she was now grounded whole free. Her phone buzzed with messages, invitations, demands. She ignored them. Instead, she brewed tea and sat in silence. Peace had become her greatest luxury. Elsewhere, Kofi finished his shift late. His clothes were soaked, his muscles aching. But his steps were steady as he walked back to his small room. He lay down, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rain. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like running. He felt like staying. And sometimes, that is how redemption begins. The final season of the year arrived quietly, without ceremony, much like the final turning point in Amina's life. By now, her name was known in business circles across the region, though rarely attached to scandal or spectacle. She had become something rarer than a powerful woman. She had become a trusted one. Her projects were no longer experiments. They were systems functioning, expanding, replicating. Communities once written off as unproductive now had training centers, employment pipelines, and local leadership rising from within. Amina didn't attend every opening. She didn't need to. Her presence was felt in structure, not spotlight. One afternoon, she sat in a quiet conference room reviewing reports. The numbers were strong, the impact measurable. Lives changed not dramatically overnight, but steadily, sustainably. Mr. Owusu entered with a folder. There's one more item, he said. It requires your personal approval. Amina gestured for him to continue. It's a long-term trust proposal, he explained. Focused on displaced women, those abandoned by spouses, families, or circumstances. Housing, legal aid skills training. The full structure is here. Amina opened the folder slowly. As she read, memories surfaced, not painfully, but clearly. Standing in the rain with a suitcase, sleeping on a mat behind a food stall, being told to leave without mercy. She closed the folder gently. Approve it, she said. Mr. Owusu smiled. I thought you would. Later that day, Amina visited the site where the first housing units were being prepared. The land was open, the air warm, the future still unbuilt. A woman approached her, cautiously holding a small child. They told me you were the one behind this, the woman said softly. I didn't believe it. Amina knelt slightly, so they were eye level. You don't need to believe in me, she said. Just believe that your life can still change. The woman nodded, tears falling. As Amina stood, she felt something settle inside her. Not pride, but purpose, fulfilled. Across the city, Kofi stood at the edge of the same project site, later that evening finishing his shift. He watched workers pack up tools, laughing tired but satisfied. His supervisor clapped him on the shoulder. "You've earned your place here," the man said. "There's talk of expanding. We'll need leaders who understand people, not just plans." Kofi nodded, humbled. "Thank you." As he walked home, he passed a row of new housing units under construction. He didn't know who they were for. He didn't ask. He only knew that work mattered again. That night, Kofi sat alone, writing in a notebook, something he had started doing to keep himself honest. He wrote about failure, about ego, about what it cost him to confuse admiration with love. He didn't write about Amina often anymore, not because she didn't matter, but because she no longer defined him. For Amina, life slowed, not from lack of ambition, but from fulfillment. She allowed herself rest, mornings without meetings, evenings without obligations. She traveled, occasionally quietly learning from other communities, other stories. One evening, as the sun dipped low, she sat on her balcony with a cup of tea. The city below pulsed with life. She thought about how close she had come to disappearing, not physically, but spiritually. How easily she could have accepted the narrative that being discarded meant being worthless. But she hadn't. She had endured. She had learned. She had chosen herself. Her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "I hope you are well. I just wanted to say, I am trying to live differently now. Thank you for showing me that it's possible." She knew who it was. She didn't reply immediately. Then she typed one sentence. "I'm glad you're still becoming." And that was all. Months later, the first housing project opened quietly. No press, no speeches. Women moved into safe spaces. Children laughed in courtyards. New lives took root where shame once lived. Amina walked through the grounds, unnoticed, smiling softly. She didn't need recognition. Her reward was presence. That same day, Kofi received confirmation of his promotion, modest, earned, grounded. He sat alone for a long time, absorbing the moment. Not triumph, relief, growth. That night, the city slept under a sky heavy with stars. Two lives moved forward, no longer intertwined, but no longer broken. The man who once kicked his way out to chase desire had learned that shortcuts come with costs. And the woman he discarded had learned that being chosen by the world means nothing if you never choose yourself. Their paths crossed once more, only in meaning, not in motion. And that was enough. Because in the end, this story was never about money. It was about worth. It was about consequence. It was about the quiet, unstoppable power of a woman who refused to disappear when the world told her she should. Life has a way of revealing truth when we least expect it. Sometimes, the people we undervalue are the ones carrying the greatest strength. Sometimes, rejection becomes the doorway to purpose. And sometimes, the greatest justice isn't revenge, it's growth. If you were ever underestimated, abandoned, or made to feel small, remember this: your worth does not depend on who chooses you. It depends on who you choose to become. What would you do if life gave you a second chance to redefine yourself? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if stories like this remind you that hope is real and character still matters, don't forget to subscribe to the channel.